At 2:17 in the morning, my phone vibrated on the nightstand. Not a call, not a message, a motion alert. The kind you don't get unless someone is standing exactly where they're not supposed to be. I rolled over half asleep, tapped the notification, and watched a woman I barely knew absolutely lose her mind on my security camera. She was standing at the entrance to my ranch, pounding both fists against a steel gate she didn't own, screaming about property rights she didn't have, demanding access to land she had no legal authority over. Her voice cut through the quiet like glass breaking. The gate didn't move, it didn't beep, it didn't unlock, and that's when she started, yelling threats loud enough that even my microphone picked them up clearly. That's the moment most people think this story starts. But it didn't. That moment was just the symptom. The real problem started weeks earlier, on the day I decided to leave the city and buy a ranch that wasn't part of any HOA. For most of my adult life, I did exactly what I was supposed to do. I lived in the city, commuted every day, worked long hours, paid rising rent, and slowly watched my patience disappear. Noise through the walls, neighbors policing parking spots like property lines, rules layered on top of rules, most of them enforced by people who seemed to enjoy telling others how to live. After my divorce, it felt even smaller, too quiet inside the apartment, too loud everywhere else. The kind of place where you never really relax because someone is always close enough to hear you exist. The weekend I found the ranch, I wasn't even seriously looking. I just drove out of the city to clear my head and kept going until buildings turned into trees and traffic turned into gravel. The property sat at the end of a long stretch of land, bordered on one side by forest and on the other by a newer suburban development. The listing was clear: private land, no HOA, grandfathered access road. 50 acres of quiet that had existed long before anyone put up matching mailboxes and community signs. Standing there for the first time, I could feel the difference immediately. No shared fences, no posted rules about lawn length or paint colors, just land that didn't care what time I woke up or how I lived my life. I bought it less than a month later. Moving in felt like exhaling for the first time in years. The first night was so quiet it almost felt loud. No sirens, no neighbors pacing above me, just wind moving through trees and the occasional sound of something small moving in the brush. I remember thinking, finally, this is mine. That feeling lasted exactly 3 days. The first sign of trouble came in the form of a woman walking up my driveway like she belonged there. She was dressed perfectly for the role she thought she played. Clean sneakers, pressed clothes, clipboard held tight against her chest like a badge. She smiled at me in a way that didn't reach her eyes and introduced herself before I could ask why she was standing on private property. She told me her name and explained very carefully that she was the HOA president for the neighboring community. She said it like it automatically meant something to me. Then she congratulated me on my purchase, and immediately followed it with a list of things I needed to be aware of. At first, I thought she was just being informative. She talked about shared roads, community standards, neighbor expectations. I listened politely until she casually mentioned that modifications to exterior access points required HOA approval. That's when I stopped her. I told her my property wasn't part of the HOA. I said it calmly. No attitude, no challenge, just a simple correction. The smile stayed on her face for exactly 1 second longer than necessary before tightening in a way that felt practiced. She flipped a page on her clipboard and pointed to something I hadn't seen before, claiming my access road fell under community oversight. I told her again, calmly, that it didn't, that the land predated the development, that the deed was clear. That's when her tone changed. She didn't raise her voice, she didn't yell. She leaned in slightly and spoke slower, like she was explaining something obvious to a child. She said the HOA had certain expectations and that new owners sometimes didn't understand how things worked around here. Then she pulled out her phone and took pictures of my driveway, my fence line, and my truck. I asked her to leave. She told me she'd be in touch. Over the next week, the letters started arriving. At first, they were polite notices, friendly reminders, clarifications. Then they became warnings, alleged violations, claims about noise levels, vehicle placement, and aesthetic concerns. None of them made sense. Most of them referenced rules that didn't apply to my property. All of them carried the same tone, comply or else. I started noticing something else too. When I drove past the entrance of the neighboring development, people avoided eye contact. Conversations stopped when I approached. One older man actually turned around and walked the other way when he saw me. It wasn't subtle, and it wasn't random. One afternoon, a code enforcement officer pulled into my driveway. He was polite, professional, and clearly uncomfortable. He explained that a complaint had been filed about unpermitted work on my land. I walked him around the property. There was nothing to see because nothing had changed. He nodded, apologized for the inconvenience, and left. 2 days later, another visit. Different complaint, same result. By the end of the second week, I realized something important. This wasn't about rules. It wasn't about community, standards. It was about control. I started talking to people who would actually speak to me. Quiet conversations near mailboxes, short exchanges at gas stations, and slowly, a pattern emerged. I wasn't the first person she'd done this to. Anyone who wasn't part of her circle, anyone who didn't blend in, anyone who owned something she couldn't influence directly. The realization hit hard. I had bought peace, but I had accidentally stepped into someone else's territory. Not legally, psychologically, and she didn't like that. That's when I stopped reacting emotionally and started paying attention. I saved every letter, logged every visit, installed security cameras not because I felt paranoid, but because something felt off. The more documentation I gathered, the clearer it became that this wasn't casual harassment. It was systematic. And the more resistant I remained, the more aggressive the pressure became. I still didn't install the gate at that point. I still believed that if I stayed calm, factual, reasonable, the situation would resolve itself. That turned out to be my last mistake before things escalated completely. Because when someone like her realizes they can't control you with paperwork, they start trying other methods. And that's when I began to understand that this wasn't going to end quietly. That was just the beginning. Once I stopped responding to the letters, things changed. Not immediately, but noticeably. The tone shifted from passive-aggressive to openly confrontational. Instead of mailed notices, people started showing up. First, it was contractors claiming to be checking utilities. Then survey flags appeared near my boundary line, placed there without permission. One afternoon, I caught 2 men standing at the edge of my access road, taking measurements. When I asked who sent them, they gave each other a look before telling me they were working under HOA direction. That was the moment I knew this had crossed from annoying into deliberate. I told them they were trespassing and asked them to leave. They did, but not before one of them mentioned, almost casually, that the road I used was a shared concern. The words stuck with me because they didn't sound accidental. They sounded rehearsed. The complaints ramped up after that. Noise reports during hours I wasn't even home. Dust complaints during rainfall. Claims that my truck was damaging community infrastructure. Every report ended the same way, no violation found. But each one cost me time, energy, and sleep. And that, I realized, was the point. What made it worse was the feeling of being watched. Cars slowing as they passed my driveway. People stopping just long enough to take photos. Once, I found boot prints near my equipment shed that hadn't been there the day before. Nothing was stolen, but something about it felt intentional, like a reminder that she could still reach me. I considered confronting her directly, but every instinct told me that was exactly what she wanted. Emotion, reaction, something she could twist. Instead, I did the opposite. I went quiet. I stopped acknowledging anything that didn't come from an official authority. And I started researching. County records were easy enough to pull. What surprised me wasn't what I found, but how clear it was. My property had been subdivided decades before the housing development existed. The access road wasn't shared. It was recorded, permitted, and exclusively tied to my parcel. No easement in favor of the HOA, no conditional use, no gray area. To be safe, I took everything to a land use attorney. I expected caution. What I got was something closer to disbelief. He told me she had no authority over my land, no legal standing, no enforcement power whatsoever. He also told me that if what I described was accurate, she was exposing the HOA and herself to serious trouble. That conversation changed how I slept that night. For the first time since moving in, I didn't feel like I was defending myself. I felt like I was waiting. The attorney suggested something simple. Document everything, stay calm, and if I wanted to stop the harassment, I had every legal right to restrict access to my property. That's when the idea of the gate stopped being a thought and became a plan. It wasn't about revenge. It wasn't about sending a message. It was about boundaries. Physical ones, the kind that don't argue or explain themselves. I filed the permit, hired a licensed installer, and chose a design that was visible, solid, and unmistakably private. No spikes, no warnings. Just a locked, lawful barrier at the point where my land began. Installation took 2 days. During those 2 days, I watched more cars slow down than I ever had before. People stared. Phones came out. Someone stopped and asked one of the workers what the gate was for. I didn't intervene. I didn't need to. She showed up on the second afternoon. This time there was no clipboard, no forced smile. She parked dangerously close to the equipment and marched straight toward me, demanding to know what I thought I was doing. I told her exactly what I was doing. Securing my property. She told me I couldn't do that. I told her I already had. Her voice echoed across the open land, as she insisted the road was community access. I calmly explained that it wasn't. She accused me of isolating neighbors. I reminded her I had never agreed to serve them. When she brought up consequences, I simply told her to put everything in writing. That made her angrier than yelling ever could have. She began contacting me repeatedly after that. Emails, voicemails, messages sent through third parties. Each one more unhinged than the last. Some warned of fines she couldn't enforce. Others referenced meetings I wasn't invited to attend. One message told me flat out that she would handle this personally if I didn't cooperate. I didn't reply to a single one. The gate went up the following week. Smooth steel, clean lines. An electronic lock paired to my phone. A small, unobtrusive camera angled toward the entrance. Nothing dramatic, nothing aggressive. Just final. Within hours, the fallout began. I got calls from neighbors I'd never spoken to before. Some were angry, others sounded nervous. A few apologized for her behavior without directly naming it. One woman quietly admitted that people had been using my access road as a shortcut for years even though they knew they weren't supposed to. The gate apparently ruined morning routines. That night a car sat idling near the entrance for almost 10 minutes. It didn't try to open the gate. It just sat there. When it finally left, I checked the camera footage. I knew exactly who was in the driver's seat. After that, things spiraled quickly. Letters turned into formal-looking notices stamped with HOA logos. None of them meant anything legally, but they were designed to intimidate. When that didn't work, she tried a different approach. She showed up in person again, this time with 2 board members in tow, demanding access for inspection. I refused. Calmly. On camera. She accused me of hiding violations. I reminded her she had no jurisdiction. One of the board members looked uncomfortable. The other wouldn't make eye contact. That interaction ended with her promising me that I hadn't heard the last of it. She was right. Because once the gate existed, she stopped pretending this was about rules. It became personal. She drove to the entrance multiple times a day. She tested the keypad. She yanked on the gate hard enough that I worried about the hinges. Once, she stood there and screamed into the open land, accusing me of stealing what belonged to the community. Each time, I documented. Each time, I stayed inside. Each time she grew more frantic. The attorney told me something then that stuck with me. People who rely on authority they don't actually have tend to escalate when boundaries finally appear. They see it as an insult, a threat, and they make mistakes. I didn't know what form her mistake would take. I just knew it was coming. The night the alert woke me up, I wasn't surprised. I was tired. I opened the camera feed and watched her pace back and forth in front of the gate, phone pressed to her ear, voice sharp and loud enough to carry across the land. Her words were frantic now, no longer controlled. She wasn't talking to me. She was talking to someone else, someone she expected to fix this for her. And when that didn't happen, she turned all that anger on a gate that didn't care who she thought she was. I watched as she hit it, pulled at it, shouted demands into the darkness like the land itself should answer her back. And that's when she made the mistake that changed everything. Because by the time flashing lights appeared at the end of the road, she had already said too much, done too much, and proven exactly what I had been documenting all along. I leaned back, set my phone down, and waited. The flashing lights came into view slowly, bouncing off the trees as a patrol vehicle turned onto the access road. Even before it stopped, I could see her posture change. The confidence drained out of her movements, replaced by something sharp and desperate. She stepped back from the gate, smoothed her hair, and tried to look composed, as if the previous 10 minutes of screaming hadn't happened. The camera captured everything. The sudden calm, the forced smile, the moment she realized she wasn't in control anymore. I stayed inside and watched as the officers stepped out of their vehicle. They didn't rush. They didn't escalate. One of them spoke first, asking what was going on. She launched into her explanation immediately, talking over him, gesturing wildly at the gate as if it was the problem standing there. She claimed she needed access, that the road belonged to the HOA, that I was unlawfully blocking community property. The officer listened, nodding occasionally, then asked her a simple question. Did she own the property? She hesitated, just for a moment. Then she said no, but that was enough. When he asked for documentation, she pulled out her phone, scrolling furiously through emails and PDFs that didn't matter. HOA bylaws, board minutes, internal letters. The officer explained calmly and clearly that none of those granted her authority over private land. He asked if she had been asked to leave before. She said no. The footage said otherwise. That's when the tone shifted. The officer walked closer to the gate and examined it briefly. He didn't tug on it. He didn't challenge it. He simply noted the posted signage, the locked mechanism, and the boundary markers. Then he turned back to her and said words I knew would land hard. This is a civil matter, but right now you're trespassing. Her face changed again, this time in a way she couldn't control. She raised her voice, insisting she couldn't be trespassing because she was responsible for the community. The other officer stepped in, warning her to lower her voice and step back. She didn't. The situation de-escalated, only because the officers made it clear they were done arguing. They asked her to leave. She refused. They asked again, louder. That refusal, captured cleanly on camera, became the moment her authority completely collapsed. Eventually, she left, not because she wanted to, but because the alternative was no longer theoretical. As she drove away shouting through an open window, one of the officers approached my door to speak with me directly. He was polite, professional, and unsurprised. When I showed him the documentation I'd been gathering, he nodded slowly. He told me I'd done exactly what I should have done. The next morning, my attorney called me before I finished my coffee. Somehow word had already spread. The HOA board had gone into emergency session overnight. Neighbors were talking. Some of them had seen her behavior firsthand. Others had received similar letters over the years and finally realized they weren't alone. The formal complaint didn't come from me. It came from multiple residents. Allegations of harassment, abuse of authority, misuse of HOA resources. When my documentation was entered into the conversation, it didn't feel like a bomb going off. It felt like confirmation. The board placed her on administrative leave pending review. She didn't handle it quietly. She sent emails accusing me of coercion, claimed I had manipulated the situation, suggested I had influenced neighbors. Each message weakened her position further. The attorney advised me not to respond, so I didn't. A week later, the notice arrived. Not from the HOA, from the county, a formal acknowledgement of complaint. They had reviewed the footage, the written records, the police report, and they were opening an investigation. That was the moment the narrative flipped. For months I had felt like the unreasonable one simply for wanting to be left alone. Now, suddenly, the spotlight wasn't on me. It was on her behavior, her decisions, her documented pattern. The board meeting that followed was standing room only. I didn't attend, but I didn't need to. Enough people had already spoken. She was removed from her position that week, effective immediately. The language in the letter was carefully neutral, but the message was clear. Her authority was gone. I expected to feel victorious. I didn't. What I felt instead was relief. The letters stopped. The drive-bys stopped. The road stayed quiet. A few neighbors reached out afterwards, some to apologize, others to thank me for standing firm. One man admitted he'd paid fines for rules that never applied to him because it was easier than fighting. The gate stayed closed, not out of spite, but because it needed to, because boundaries, once established, aren't meant to be temporary. Over time, the ranch became what I believed it would be in the beginning. Quiet, predictable, mine. I fixed up the old shed, repaired the fence line, watched seasons change without interruption. Every so often I'd get asked if I regretted installing the gate. The answer was always the same: no, Not because she couldn't open it, but because I finally understood something important. Authority isn't about volume. It isn't about titles or clipboards or official-looking paper. It's about who actually has the right to decide what happens on their land. If you've ever dealt with someone like her, you know how subtle it starts, how reasonable it sounds, how easy it is to doubt yourself. My only regret is not trusting my instincts sooner. If this story sounds familiar, you're not alone. And if there's one thing I hope it does, it's remind people that knowing your rights isn't about conflict, it's about peace. The gate is still there, locked, quiet, exactly how it should be.